Discograffiti, the deep dive podcast for music obsessives that gives maniacs like you and me the chance to connect with a brotherhood obsessed with rating the entire discography of every single artist and band that ever mattered. I'm your host, Dave Gebroe, and when I was a kid, I thought I loved music. But no, that was only the beginning. I almost lost my life, and in the process, it made music a top priority in a way I'd thought was completely unimaginable. I quit my job, went all in on Discograffiti, and never looked back. And so, with 3 new episodes each week, you're going to gain a comprehensive knowledge of an act's history and output in the time it takes to listen to one album. Each new guest swings a hard left into an area you either had no idea you needed to know about, or know all about and can't believe you're not alone out there. And in this episode, we'll be turning our spray cans on love! Psst! Along with our special guest, Joe Kennedy. This episode is part of a series called 7 and 7 and 7 Is, the definitive 21-episode story of Arthur Lee and Love, which I've consciously crafted to act as the ultimate repository of fact and opinion on one of the greatest bands to ever walk the face of the earth, the almighty Love. It includes 13 episodes heralding the return of Discograffiti host OG Joe Kennedy, 6 episodes from a 4.5-hour interview with OG Love mainstay Johnny Echols, and 2 episodes from a 2.5-hour interview with the members of Baby Lemonade, who've served as Love now for coming up on 35 years. This is part 15, covering a hard partying era during the early 1970s when Arthur's life started to spin wildly out of control. Here are just a few of the many things that Joe discusses with Discograffiti in this podcast. The 2 months during which Arthur had a major label deal and what he did with that opportunity. Whether or not the music created during that time was even intended for human ears, or any other species for that matter. Arthur's transition into shooting cocaine. That time he called the cops on himself. Arthur's continuing insistence on sing-song vengeance tunes written for backstabbing friends, and an in-depth track-by-track deep dive on every song off Dear You, aka Love Lost, and Arthur's solo debut, Vindicator. And away we go then! We're here with the preeminent Joseph Kennedy, Esquire.
Hello.
And we are on a very, very special era of the love madness, which is Dear You / Love Lost and Vindicator. Now, this era is really tucked away in the recesses. Some of it was not available for a very long time. It was just unreleased, shelved. But man, are the stories thought-provoking and insane. So this is kind of an amazing episode, none of which I knew about before actually getting into the research part, and it actually kicks off on April 1st.
I had to dig a little bit to find some of this stuff. Vindicator is on the streamers, but the Dear You collection is not. We'll get to that later, but It was a little bit of a dig to even find some of this stuff that we're talking about today.
Well, Vindicator I've had for, we'll get to it when we get to it, but I was very familiar with Vindicator. I've had it for a very long time, but Dear You I'd never even heard of, and there's a good reason for that. So let's just jump in because there's a lot to talk about here. On April 1st, which turns out to be extremely appropriate in this particular case, Arthur signed a solo recording contract with Columbia Records, then known as CBS, and he began new sessions on May 5th, 1971 at the label studio. He would continue for a total of 13 sessions until CBS finally shut it down on July 15th. Along with Arthur, Frank Fayed, Don Poncher, and Craig Tarwater played on those tapes. The dates were marked by a loose party atmosphere fueled by a boatload of drugs.
Arthur's friend Len Fagan says, I was there for a few of those sessions at Columbia, and there was no music being made. Arthur had me come down without my drums, but he made me sign in, so I got session money. It was just chaos. There was too much ingestion of inebriating substances. I sure didn't hear any music going on when I was there. Maybe they did when I wasn't around, but all I saw was a whole bunch of craziness. I felt so sorry seeing Arthur go from being a big star, the biggest in L.A., to this. No wonder Columbia dropped him.
Herbie Worthington remembers Arthur being rebuked for his slothfulness. He says, one of the Columbia executives, this guy with one arm, and by the way, after digging around a bit, I found out the guy was likely an older A&R chief named Jack Gold. That's how much of a rabbit hole I got into here, trying to figure out who this guy was. He called Arthur into his office and really ripped him a new asshole. When we got back to the house, Arthur said to me, this guy just fucking reamed me. And then he said, you know, Herbie, sometimes I need that. The fact that he admitted that really knocked me on the ground. He would never usually show a weak side or any vulnerability.
Ultimately, the raw tracks were too messy for the fussy corporate taste of the early 70s, and the tapes were deemed unreleasable by the suits. Arthur's contract was terminated on November 30th, 1971. Arthur's one and only experience with a major never even got off the ground. 8 months of living hell for the corporate brass was all they could take. Whether the loosey-goosey vibe here was a conscious aesthetic choice or the sound of a band and its leader fucking up left and right is almost beside the point. The abandoned CBS tracks, most still in demo form, were finally released in 2009 as the album Love Lost on Sun-Dazed Records.
All right, so before we jump into this, I just want to say, it was unreleased, and then, like Joe said, released in 2009. I don't actually count it as like a rateable release, and for a few reasons. Number one, I don't even know, based on, the stories behind this, if he even intended this stuff to be an album, because it sounds like he was just too taken away by whatever demons were going on to be serious about this. Plus, it wasn't released for so long, and this mess of a mountain of material actually became the source of what he wound up milking for the next few years for a bunch of records, which is kind of weird. It's like some of his weakest material, and it wound up being like what he picked from, the carcass from which he picked for a bunch of upcoming records. So this was supposed to be Arthur's comeback. The Columbia album was going to be called Dear You. Sunday's version was called Love Lost. It comes off as so flat and listless, it's really kind of hard to tell how much effort he was really putting into this batch of tracks. And strangely, especially knowing who Arthur was, and they had to know a little bit of his background and some of his reputation, Columbia did not assign a producer for these sessions. A clear-headed producer, one who was capable of adding some discipline, some focus and editing, might well have crafted Dear You into a remarkable rebirth. Love Lost, then, interweaves rock with fly-on-the-wall acoustic tracks. Arthur's indulgences, a tendency to oversing into a screech, not to mention some era-embraced misogyny, they do blunt the overall impact as far as I'm concerned. And despite Columbia's abandonment of the project, Lee hardly gave up on this body of work. Like I said, revisiting 12 of the 14 songs on upcoming albums. You have 7 of the tracks from this record going on to 1972's Vindicator, and then 5 going into 1973's Black Beauty and 1974's Reel to Reel. All right, that concludes your free sneak peek into today's bonus episode. If you want to hear the rest of it, just visit patreon.com/discograffiti and either purchase this podcast by itself for $4, or better yet, subscribe at the major tier and get access to Discograffiti's 3 weekly episodes. That's Friday's main episode, the Sunday Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast. That's our podcast within a podcast featuring Patreon members as guests, and your Tuesday bonus episode. Please keep in mind this is entirely how I support my wife and 7-year-old son, so don't risk feeling badly about yourself by not supporting Discograffiti. Become a member so you don't miss a single thing at patreon.com/discograffiti.